talk about this meat because I usually stay away from this stuff is, yeah, she was born like, she couldn't swallow at all. Like she had a genetic thing we didn't know.
She couldn't swallow it.
She couldn't swallow at all. Beginning, she couldn't really breathe. So she spent like 6 weeks in the NICU, had 3 surgeries while she was, no, it was 2 surgeries while she was there, and then the third one not long after she got out. And it wasn't until last month, I think it was last month, that she could actually functionally swallow fluids. And so she's over a year old. And so that's the kind of difficulty that things have been kind of.
Is it a physical problem or?
Yeah, well, it's a genetic thing, and what it did is it caused some structural things in the throat. So there's a surgery there, and then it's since it wasn't right to begin with, and all that stuff's kind of autonomic. It's trying to get her to keep up attempting without breaking that mind-body kind of connection of this is what food is, this is how you eat, this is the bodily reaction that you get, because all that stuff's just stuff we do naturally. And so that's basically what we've been doing for the last year, is keeping up with all of that. And anytime you do that, all that stuff's on a schedule to where typically you talk about 3-hour cycles, and out of that 3 hours, an hour and a half gets chewed up. And because it takes an hour to pump the food and you have to hold it that whole time and stuff and all that. So I'd lose probably somewhere in the hour 6 to 8, 9, 10 hours a day kind of thing, just depending on how life's going. Oh yeah. And then offsetting between my wife and I, it's like we can split it up, but still that's still a bear for a 24-hour schedule kind of thing. But that's way off topic, and it's now 1 o'clock.
But it's important.
Oh, it is. It is. It's one of those things that's like, oh my goodness, there's nothing. It's sort of like, at the end of the day, like career advice. It's like when you sit down and look at it, it's like no matter what you do, there are going to be problems. And so it's trying to fit what career problems you want to have, life problems kind of thing to some degree. And everything has problems. It's just what kinds of problems you want. Some problems are better than others. And make sure you choose wisely kind of thing. And the family one's usually one that's like, no matter how rough it gets, it doesn't really matter. Because at the end of the day, if you think about humanity and what it is to even live, that's going to be one of the next closest living organisms to you quite directly. It's like, it's like you can't get much more important than that. But that's life. And we're into a whole bunch of really cool stuff now. So I'm going to change up the flow of things a little bit, because I don't like the way the book moved from what was it? It was here. I think the outline's probably better on here, where it goes political crime, terrorism, then goes economic, public crime, that kind of thing. You need to jump from politics to public, because the two are just reflections of one another. In terms of theories that we talked about, usually that they frame in terms of like the power dynamics associated with conflict or Marxism. It's like, yeah, you have that there, but it's more than just that. When we say the public, what is it that we actually mean? I talked a little bit about that last time. I said, some countries will use that phrase, and at the same time, what they mean is not the same thing. When you have, those who say that they represent versus those, I should say, not those who actually do, because that's not really where it is. It's how do you tell that they actually do? That's the question, and that's a really, really hard thing to grapple with. And so, one of the things that we start looking at are crimes against public order, and yeah. So this is where we're moving. So it's I kind of skipped because we start talking about government stuff, and so if we're going to deal with like crimes against government, that kind of thing, we need to immediately turn and start looking at, well, if we're dealing with the government, what is meant by the public? Because at that point in time, that relative nature of life really kicks in. And so if we can identify one or the other of those things, we can understand what's really going on at play here. And so what you have is that aspect of whether it's representation or just function, and what's really taking place here. And so basically, are these things the same? And if so, or if not, how so? And basically what you're getting at here is, we've talked a little bit about whether you're talking population numbers and that kind of thing, voting, that kind of stuff. That influence of just people, groups, numbers to some degree, and its effect on, well, your governmental processes. and how those things change over time, because when we start looking at public order stuff, well, these are the ones that have been seeing a lot of changes in the last few decades. These are the ones where you see some of the biggest changes that have some of the biggest implications, not from necessarily the seriousness of crime, but from that whole moral, ethical standpoint. And so this is the one where you'll have some strong feelings. Everybody does. But when it comes down to how these things ultimately manifest, it's a very, very complex thing whenever you start dealing with the specific subjects. The first thing here is, let's see, probably a discussion of harm, but I don't know if I'll frame it in terms of the way the book does to begin with, because it starts out with one argument that doesn't make both. And so when you're dealing with the public, when you're dealing with crime, you know, crime itself, it's like you got those elements associated with it, or whether you're talking about, you know, in terms of theory and how those elements converge to create crime, or if you're talking about, okay, this is how we deal with crime in the legal system. It's like you're still talking elements kind of thing. Big one here is harm. And for it to be a crime, there needs to be some. So who's harmed here? If we're having a crime that's against the public order, or crimes against the public, or public crimes, however they want to call it here, it's like, who is harmed here? And that's one of those things that it gets very, very, very difficult to see clearly, because you can make it real fuzzy. And one of the ways that this sometimes happens is you start dealing with those numbers again, and then you start thinking about individual versus group, right? Because to some degree, whenever we say public, we mean group. And well, at the same time, when we deal with these things, we're only going to deal with it at, well, I don't want to say only deal with it at the individual level, but we do have to deal with it at the individual level as well. There are many different levels we deal with. Ultimately, that's the most refined version. I wouldn't necessarily say the lowest, just that's where you'll see the most variability. Probably a good way to look at it. How many things change. And so for this, it's is it the individual? There's an individual who's harmed, or is it a group? And since we're dealing with public stuff, it's always the group, right? But when we say that group, are we really talking about the group? Are we talking about whoever represents? Right? Who represents this group? Well, in some instances, it's the person we elected to, right? In other instances, it's not necessarily that. I mean, we've talked a little bit about, I don't know if we have to talk about group dynamics in here. In this way. We've talked about it, but usually come up with methods. If you're dealing with actual groups of people, it's like, well, you guys have been in classrooms. Like, not everybody speaks the same amount, not everybody holds the same ideas, and then depending on the nature of the group, you might have some people who are maybe more vocal or have more influence kind of thing. And so that's going to be one of those elements that's going to drive that to some degree too. So it's like whoever represents, maybe, or maybe it's whoever claims to represent one of these groups. Because what you'll see here is you know, yeah, we've got groups involved, but at the end of the day, it's going to take some actual people who are doing this, who are driving this, whether it's we get enough numbers to say that this is a group effort or just a few key individuals who are driving it. The book kind of talks about that in terms of it's like moral crusaders, right? Moral crusaders, right? Because these are important not because of their seriousness, mainly because of their commonality and how we choose to handle it as a society. These are going to be a lot of your, whether you're going to say, the book that puts it this way, victimless. You could say vice. Vice is another one that's going to be a common thread throughout these. You can also say sometimes it's going to be your nuisance stuff, your nuisance issues. And so this is how we, in theory, deal with lower level, I use that very, very, very cautiously because some of these topics in here are not be, yeah, would never take the appearances of being low level, right? Some are though, like when you're talking about public noise and things like that, it's like that's kind of nuisance. Some of these other ones though, not necessarily. First one the book moves into would be like your cross section of those, your sex-based crimes. It's like, yeah, those are all serious crimes. But really, it's this aspect of it's going to carry the greater weight, and then where people stand on those issues that's going to determine well, how outspoken they are, and then how people align with those issues will start to determine those group dynamics to some degree, because there's that interplay there. It's a squeaky wheel kind of thing. If you've got some people who are very, very loud, very vocal and effective, you'll see things move forward, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, it'd be like saying, how many sex-based crime acts have been passed because of people like this? And it's like, just here in higher education, you say Gene Cleary. That's the reason why I have state safety statistics. If you said Megan's laws or something else, there's another one. I can't remember the name to it, which makes me really sad. But those are all specific people who did. Usually they're victims who are no longer with us, and then someone else has taken it to active stage for them and push it through. And so there's some very, very real and valid reasons why we have this process and why it should work. But there's also some things that become a little bit more questionable, like as in whoever claims to represent the group, that's one of those things that's going to become a problem. Who actually is the person harmed, and who's the one who actually enforces these things? And ultimately, it's like, are they really the same party? When you start getting into those that enforce it, and those who determine whether or not the harm is actually incurred, it gets a bit difficult to deal those things out. It'd be like, think about your constitutional rights, that first one, the rights that are in that First Amendment, and all the ways that these public order things affect your ability to speak, your ability to gather, your ability to any number of things. For example, here's one where you're going to get some moral issues, the COVID stuff. In some instances, you had government shut down public institutions like churches and things like that for that public good. Who's harmed there? And who's really the one who's enforcing it and why? It's not immediately clear what's going on there, because it could be that you really are doing this for public interest, but then again, it might not be. That would be like California, who you can't have open air eating, but if you're running a movie set, you can't. It's like, okay, the dollar value there is what you're making that determination on, and that's not good practice, right? And so you start to see those things in some of the mundane, but when you start getting off into the seriousness is where it really, really starts to get there. The book talks about this in terms of focusing on this first element here, this victim aspect of it and the harm. And what they say is this factor called social harm. And what they mean there is it's basically back to this question again of individual versus group, that even in our victimless crimes, is there harm incurred? And so the first one the book addresses are your sex crimes. And if you stop and think about that as a general practice, theoretically or functionally, it's like, okay, you can kind of see some differences there. If we deal with our history with prostitution exclusively, because that's one that in some instances is quite legal. Does that produce a social harm? It's like, well, theoretically, if you have someone who's engaging in consensual behavior, maybe, not immediately clear, right? And so if it's consensual with those who are involved, then what is the harm then? It's like, okay, does what's produced create a harm to the group? And then how do we identify that? And some of these, it's more cursory. Some of these, it's more direct. It's like, okay, you deal with that one. Yeah, all of the people involved are not just the parties to the crime themselves. If you view it as a crime, it's gonna be those who, you know, have to go through the conditions that are associated with it. How well regulated are those? How bad are they gonna be? Who all are the parties that are involved in this? Because it's not just the victims, it's, you know, are there other individuals involved in the situations, other people who are exposed to those types of incidents? Or the children at risk, that kinds of thing. And so you do have very real social harms that come in you. And then on the social side, it's like, okay, in terms of what's acceptable and what's not, you go right back to this individual versus group. People see some things as acceptable, groups don't. And so what is the dominant idea here? All right. So introduction, fact or fiction. Prostitution should be legalized because it's a victimless crime and many prostitutes make a substantial amount of money. That's a fiction. Here it says, public order crimes typically create boundaries rather than bright lines. So whenever they say boundaries rather than bright lines are those things that when you cross them, you'll know that you're going to cross them before you do. Boundaries tend to be a little bit more porous, I guess, is a way to look at it. The line is a little bit less clear, a little bit more muddy, right? Here it says, it's legal to drink at age 21, a crime at age 20, even though 20-year-olds can fight for their country, vote in elections, that kind of thing. It's like, yeah, so there's some issue there. It's like that effect with age. When do you hit that full majority age? You're no longer considered a minority in terms of age. A minor, I should say minority, I should say minor.
You remember when they changed that to 18?
Yeah. And so
Do you remember why they changed it back?
violence? No, I don't.
I think it had something to do with too many kids are getting in trouble.
Yeah.
18 and 21. It was a numbers game.
Mhm.
And it's a
It
public
really is.
safety issue.
Yeah, and it really is. It's sort of like,
Yeah, and it's like, I always thought, that I was 18 when it changed that.
Mhm.
Drink for 20 dollars.
yeah. And so,
But it's, you're talking about the public good and.
Yeah.
Public, you know.
and so there's some balance there, because it's like,
Yeah.
okay, at that point in time, we had that lower drinking age. We did see a lot more bar fights, a lot more things of that nature, those crimes that were related. And so moving that age back a little bit, you see that those behaviors step back, but at the same time, you have that conflict of, okay, here's what we'll ask of you, here's what we'll allow you to do. It'd be like smoking tobacco. That's one that's 18 to 21. It's like, why do we limit that? Because of public health. I'm an adult. Can't I make that decision for myself? Can't I make my own best decisions? And then
So
how does that work?
is it 18 or 21 this fall? I don't smoke.
It's smoking now. It's 21.
It's 21.
It's 21 now in most states. I think basically all states. It's sort of like here in this state, we're moving a little bit against. I don't know if I'd say it's against the curve, because you see it moves in two different directions depending on states. The gun stuff. When can you buy a handgun? 21. You can buy a rifle or a shotgun at 18. What's the difference there? One's a lot more effective than the other. One's more conceivable. Effectively, it's like, really the more dangerous one's going to be, well, it just depends on how you use it, I guess. It really gets really difficult there. But the difference there is that it's still performs a basic function. We're just taking away one of those things for what could be an arbitrary reason, right? Unless you're dealing with large cities and their use of handguns, which they already make those illegal to some degree. And so it's like you get to see, okay, how are we addressing these issues? Is that numbers game working out in our favor? And is it actually producing good, or is it harm? And it's not. These things move in so many different directions. It gets real confusing. And so I think what's it move into next in here?
This is a little bit off subject, but
Yeah.
we talk about class action lawsuits.
Mhm.
If you take an individual and put them in a group.
Yeah.
Is that a public order thing or not?
It's
It's like it gets in the back.
Yeah, it's I'd say it's an ancillary related thing, because it's not directly this, but you're seeing the way the system handles individual issues that are serialized. So this is such a common issue, yeah, but there are some instances where, yeah, we'll process you as a group. And we run into that, it's like, ooh, that's gonna be one that's a big one. And those always are. That's why you see all people claim class action lawsuits, because at that point in time, you're not just representing that one person, you're representing the whole group. And because of that, you have this whosoever represents kind of thing. There's a lot of opportunity there. It's like power, I guess, if you don't look at it that way, but really it's opportunity. And so there's that. Law and morality, what does it say here? Anthony Weiner resigned from office.
Get back to that drinking thing.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, whether it's that or drugs or prostitution that are the big three here. It's like, basically what you're dealing with is to some degree, people consider those victims crimes. To some degree, some people consider those nuisances. To some degree, people will identify that, hey, there are some harms that are incurred, whether it's other parties that are exposed to it or something of that nature, or the health of people on the aggregate. It'd be like, okay, drug markets. Let's say if we decide to decriminalize all drugs, what will happen is any of your illicit drug markets will become open air drug markets overnight. When that happens, what happens to the neighborhood health for the areas that you have issues? It declines rapidly. What happens in those areas? Anyone who can get out can. Most people are stuck there, so you just put them into their own personal health. You know, it's like, thank you for that. Because basically what happened is whatever problem that was is now acceptable, and we don't view it as a problem. So now if you view it as a problem and you live in those areas, that's your problem, right? That's like in terms of the whole law enforcement kind of thing. Here's an interesting one in Chicago. Their view on the weapon stuff and all that kinds of things. In recent years, with the increases of crimes there and their movements away from punishing crimes, it's like, how many of those responsibilities get put back onto citizens, and at what point in time do you have those social issues that really arise? And it's like, okay, how many times do you find people who've been advised to go and get their gun license themselves, and you'll be issued body armor? Like, when you're talking to people about that, it's like, yeah, that's something that's literally being advised to them. At that point in time, it's like the dynamics of this thing has changed, and there's going to be issues. Here, this talks about morality, law and morality. This is Anthony Weiner, which is, if you've not heard about that, it's in the name. Guy was tweeting at people online and shouldn't have been. Yeah, and it's like, did it cause any actual harm? Essentially harmless, never had physical contact. All of those things can be deleted, but it amounted to a felony. Okay. Is it a crime to expose oneself on the internet? And what was it that it crossed from a prank to a serious offense?
Is it a crime if it's public, right? Like
I don't know. I think where you're probably getting into issues here, it would be that one right there. How old are we talking about? Right? And that's this one right here. And when we start dealing with the sex stuff, the age thing's a huge issue. How are we doing on
the other
time?
thing is if you're sending it to a person.
Yeah.
Well, let's get kind of weird here, but like, let's say you're married and your wife and you send her something, you know what I'm saying? Is that a crime?
Yeah. Well, hell,
Is it?
depending on how it works, it's like you can look at it that way. You know, it's like in terms of the way the legal system works and things like relationships.
Yeah.
That harm, it's like, in that case, you actually still have individual harm. What you look at there is, the phrase there is, alienation of affection. And you can literally, in some states, hold, like affair partners and things like that, at least civilly liable, if not criminally liable, depending on what statutes are there.
So
It's like,
was he just sending it to people that were besides his wife?
yeah, and I think some were underage, if I remember correctly, like right
So
from the cusp.
it wasn't like,
Mhm.
okay. I
Yeah.
wasn't really sure.
I think it was the age thing, if I remember correctly, because I want to say that they were like right on the cusp of being an adult, but I may not remember that correctly. It's been a few years.
So it was like somebody that wasn't
Yeah.
a consenting party.
Well, it wasn't, it was one of those things that was almost like unasked kind of thing to some degree. So you have that kind of nature of it. You have the age is going to be another aspect of it. And you have the public official element. It's
That
like,
ruined his life.
yeah, it's like, oh my goodness, what do you do?
That ruined his
Yeah,
life.
and so it's something that, you know, people would think, maybe they think it's something minor. I don't know. Anytime you start getting in these areas, it's like, realize what you're dealing with. This is something that's no matter what it is, it carries with it a significant weight. I kind of get into this, how much these things are changing, and we're I mean, literally outcry can take place.
Does it say in there about like how a bunch of Hillary's emails showed up on his computer?
It doesn't mention anything like that. Yeah. So that's one of those things that, if you're paying attention to that, that's social side. The social side is a game that's, you know, in some senses on this thing is underlying this, because it's you're dealing with people in these positions and these types of crimes, the people you have in those positions, again, whoever represents or claims to represent. And in these positions, you're elected, you claim to represent, and so you have to make sure that you do, ideally. Though they won't they won't notify things like, who is aware of what role thing people had in other things, even though it will have a direct bearing. It will. Because that's just how legal processes go. What was I gonna say here? Gives you some more things like, marrying multiple women, stealing in order to feed the poor, even if you kill a loved one to spare them pain. It's like, these are all areas where like there's some morality there, but there are some serious questions, like that first one we started talking about euthanasia. It's like, okay, have you been to Canada recently? What are the ages that they have now deemed it legally acceptable to let someone die or facilitate their death? And it's like you start dealing with things like, you get serious medical stuff, terminal issues, things of that nature, but also things like depression in youth. Like we were talking, people who just barely entered in adulthood, they have a depression, and now because they don't want to deal with it anymore, they're allowed to. Not just allowed, it's like we provide them the ability to kill themselves. Like that's one of those moral things. We need to figure that one out.
The thing of it is, they're always changing. Morality is always changing.
Yeah, it's always at flux. And to show you how bad it is, I mean, they go into this a fair bit. The first one they start talking about is, of course, prostitution. And so if you think about that, it's like, okay, think about those conditions honestly, and think about how many people are involved in it, and think about all the situations with it. And it's not going to look like, again, I said, theoretically, it's like, if you look at it from a theoretical standpoint, it's like, yeah, this could work out as an acceptable practice. But in terms of actuality, it's like, okay, when we start really delving into it, what is the nature of that thing? It's like, that's something that there is some serious harms that just can be found right out the gate. And that's before we start dealing with the issues of the actual dynamics of consent. Because if you think about domestics, for an instance, just a small second where they say, okay, economic control there is to some degree domestic abuse. Okay, that controlling the purse strings, that if you use that to influence the relationship, yeah, you're having an undue influence on that relationship because you're using something else rather than, hey, this is the relationship. The hell is this relationship? It is money. It's only that. Is that really consensual? You need money, so this is the job you can do? No. It's like this. And so that's one of those things that it gets very, very, very difficult to see how it functionally works. And you start dealing with things like okay, these issues and that age element, particularly as it relates to sex crimes. That's one, you get to a certain age threshold, and what you're doing there is one of the worst, if not the worst thing that you can do to people, right? And so where do we draw the lines on that? Is it one that's like the drinking? Is it one that's like the voting? Or is it one that we hold a little bit differently for some reason? And as we're trying to recognize that as a society, what are the different things that pop up? You see things like reasonable, like Romeo and Juliet laws, where it's like, okay, within, maybe a couple years, we'll have a little bit of leeway here because those are social interactions that they'll not necessarily be in. And at the same time, you have things like I probably have this in email. Let me look there real quick. Because if I have the specific one, I'll show you this one because it was really bad. I said the phrase minor attracted person. You ever heard that phrase before? Because if you haven't, all right, we'll show you some stuff that's nasty, and you'll see how it's being treated. And I said, in terms of nasty, that's a moral standpoint. That is one of those things. It's like, okay, there's bias involved with that because it's part of the nature of morality. This is several years old. This is in the UK. Yeah, this is about, what's that, 8 years old? No, it's more than that. No. Yeah. I'm not a monster. virtuous pedophile really reveals he's not ashamed of his sexual attraction to kids of that young of an age. Does that make them virtuous? The message that you're sending there is one full of conflict. And why is that? It's like that's something that society is at least to some degree redefining. If I said, actually, I might have it right here. Professor referred Fuzz to resign. That's good. Termination to do. That's good. There we go. That's the one right here. Here's where we start to see where the laws start to change. And so this is 4 years ago, and it was signed into law. Measures won't apply when the minor is under 14 and when the gap is larger than 10 years. But what is that gap? Yeah. Permits judge to decide whether a man should, I like how placed on the sex offender registry if they had voluntary with someone 14 to 17, and so long as there's no more than 10 years related to the person, right? So it's not necessarily criminal actions, but what we're seeing is it's the dialing back of punishments and the introductions of arguments that move this way. And it's like, what is that, right? So you're going to tell me that you're going to give a third party a choice as to whether or not someone needs on the sex offender registry if they're 24 years old and they have sex with a 14-year-old. It's like, okay, the functional difference there is a 14-year-old has just entered their freshman year of school, high school. A 24-year-old, if they've kind of kept to the timeline, is could be a master's student graduate. And that's if they follow standard timelines and they don't try to rush things, kind of thing. And so it's like, we are on two completely different levels here. In what way do you see that is any way a situation to where there can be any voluntary nature there? The disparity of people's developments alone is one that tilts the table there to where most people recognize it. It's just kind of be an automatic thing, right?
I don't understand why they pass laws like that.
Well, that's got to do with
the only thing that I think, and I hate to say this, it's the people that are passing the laws. Why do they think they need to pass that law?
Yeah.
Is it a personal reason? Is it what it?
Are they representing certain people?
Something.
Right, because they're supposed to be representing groups, and it's this, that area.
Yeah, but that's not the majority of people, probably.
No.
You think it's like a democracy or?
Yeah, and it's like, and as you start thinking about these types of things, it's like, okay, you got the prostitution element, you've got the what's acceptable related to an element, you've got the other element I was going to show you guys is something like this, and it's like, okay, boom. What are the attachments for other things that are related to it? This is the one for this is again about the same time frame where they're having a big push towards that. It seemed like new California law reduces the penalty for here, let me share this. No, it's still sharing with you guys. Good. Reduces the penalty for knowingly exposing someone to HIV. It's like, is that something that we should reduce? If I remember correctly, it moved it from, was it felony to a misdemeanor kind of thing?
They kind of figure maybe it's not you can't, well, you could die from it.
Yeah, it's still a potential death sentence.
Because they have not a cure for it, but they have treatments for it.
Yeah.
Is it that the reasoning behind it? I don't know. I'm guessing.
No.
It's not a death sentence to give it to somebody.
I don't know. But it's one of those things that there's some interplay here, right? Those who were victimized in this fashion, they're going to want something. If you had a lifetime sentence to something, would a simple misdemeanor be the way forward? Right? We start looking at financial crimes, those of theft, larceny, and things like that. How long before we get into seriously long amounts of time? And what's the cost that's going to be associated with just the medicines kind of thing? It's like, what are we doing here? Right? Are we treating things similarly that are similarly? Are we treating things different that are different? And if we're moving in different directions on things, why? And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out, whether we're using theory or we're just looking at the issues themselves.
When did that happen?
That was under.
That's been a while.
Yeah, that one was Jeffrey Brown's. That one was 2017. Yeah, so about that same time. Oh, look, and there's that guy. And so isn't that interesting? And so it's like the politics element is there too. And so that's this to some degree, when you get to that representation side, is that's that political element, and seeing that it functions in a positive direction is not always immediately apparent. And so you get to see those types of things relatively quickly. Where is my, okay, stop share for a second. And then we'll go into, where's that book at? Okay, so they talk about things like, yeah, prostitutions, the money, those types of things. Actually, I'll show you one other one. Was this in my sent? Yeah. And so when it comes to the directions that we take it, and its societal acceptance is to some degree where we start to get here. Whether we view it as victimless or not, whether we want to view it, as whether there's any actual harm to individuals too, kind of thing.
So what crimes are considered vice? I know prostitution.
Prostitution, gambling, drugs.
Now, gambling's an
Yeah.
interesting thing, because everything used to be illegal, and now it's like it's pretty much legalized.
Oh my goodness, and gambling, when it comes to gambling, one of the things I don't talk so much about, and I don't know if I mentioned it here when we're talking about learning, it is one of the strongest behaviors to learn because of the schedule it runs. So if you really got into the Skinner stuff, basically what you'll find out is like you got positive reinforcements, negative reinforcements, and punishments. It's actually the schedule for reinforcements that dictates how well produced, how often it's produced, that kind of thing, the behavior you're looking for. If you do it where it's a random reinforcement, once the behavior's learned, so where it's just purely at random, whether or not you're going to get a reward for doing something, the behavior goes from like skyrockets, because at each time you don't get it, you think that the likelihood that you're going to get it next increases, even though the chance never once changes. And so you keep pressing that button, keep dropping in cords, you keep pulling that lever or whatever it is. And so it's like, in terms of evil, if we are dealing with actual evil practices, it's like, that moral kind of thing, it's like, ooh, that's a really nasty one, and people don't realize it because they consent to it. And they don't realize that that's what's at play. And so there's a lot to delve into with this. And like from the sex thing, it's like, what is acceptable, what isn't? And if we're starting to deal with is prostitution now no longer a crime at all? And is it this? Is it something that now that people have viewed sex in the way that it's, I don't want to use the word cavalier because that's not the word, casual maybe might be the right word. What exactly transpires? And you start seeing things like, well, here's one that's kind of interesting. Ohio State unit, this is also a few years old. Oh, seminar promoting OnlyFans platform to students. Because OnlyFans is a way that you can monetize sexual behavior, right? And so here what you have is a university that's not just promoting it. What they did is they taught it. And in these lessons, they taught them how to set up OnlyFans, how to run these types of things. And so it's like at this point in time, you are literally prostituting your students out for the dollar bill. It's like, how awful is that in one perspective? And in another perspective, people see it as, I don't know, something maybe that they're already engaging in and looking to make money off of it. Maybe, I don't know. I don't quite understand it myself. But it'd be like talking about the difference between, what is the difference between this, its issue with prostitution and its overlap with pornography? What is the difference? What's the difference between a pornographic artist and a prostitute? That you're paying them to make a video versus you're just paying them. And so are we really dealing with something different? And then if we deal with that 4-letter word right there, where is our society on that one? Like, some societies control that, and they control your flow and access to it. We don't. And in fact, at times where we've had statutes that criminalize it, it's like, how do you even tell what's criminal? Is pornography itself criminal, or is it artwork? And basically, the best that you can get from you in the Supreme Court itself for a hard decision is I know it when I see it. It's a qualitative thing. Ooh, that doesn't sound like a good way to operate, but it is sometimes the best you can do. And so it's like, literally, is this something that has some artistic value? Is it something that's producing some type of social harm? Or is it something that's producing a very direct harm? And so you get,
There was something on there that you showed earlier. I just read this about some kind of a thing in Paris in 1917. And they're showing the differences about between what used to be pornography. And
Yeah.
just naked picture, naked.
Yeah, it's
drawings,
artwork.
But now it's like nothing. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it just shows you how it just keeps changing.
Oh, yeah, and it does, and
And pornography now may be kind of controversial,
Mhm.
but you're talking 100 years from now, nobody will even think about it, but they, maybe not even 100 years, let's say 20 years from now,
yeah,
they won't, it's no,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter.
yeah, well, it's like,
It's not a morality thing.
Well, it's like you go back to like old depictions before, screens.
Yeah,
It's
that's,
like,
I think that's.
yeah, and it's like these pictures kind of thing. It's like, oh, that's some really bad stuff, or what is it, the kids' toys that you have where you put the thing up and flip the little things.
Kaleidoscope.
Yeah, I forget what
Well,
those.
yeah, it's not a kaleidoscope.
Yeah, but yeah, so it's got little pictures that you
I know
slide
what
on,
you're
yeah.
talking
And it's like back then they used to have the same things for pornography, the 3D images. And it's like, yeah, it's like, good golly, I mean, people have always had that kind of particular bend to them, but hey, if you got a hold of that, it's like, that'd be something that largely be criminalized. Back then, today, it's how much access is it? How easy is it to access? And what kinds of things can you see if you want to? It's like, oh, those are all things you do not want to talk about. I don't want to talk about for certain. And so it's like, is that good for society? Is it harmful? Not clear.
That's $1 million question.
Yeah.
It's $1 billion.
Yeah, and
What is harmful?
And then so if we start looking at it from that perspective, you can expand even farther. And it's like, here it starts talking about moral persuades and moral entrepreneurs, that kind of thing. So take this same issue and apply it to something that has had significant changes in the past couple of generations and things like homosexuality. It's like, okay, from a practice, it's like, okay, what are we literally regulating? We're regulating people's private consensual behaviors in their houses. It's like, you don't get any more intrusive. And like, that one's kind of one of those ironic things. It's like, you literally do not get more intrusive than that. At the same time, it's like, was it the religious tenet? Maybe, I guess their reasoning behind it is what you look at is biological reproduction, the ability to pass, at least from the religious standpoint, the ability to pass that religion on in people. And so they've got some vested interest. So to some degree, society's going to be invested in reproduction. And so to what degree do we criminalize that and to what degree we don't? It's like, just look at how many different things that we've got related to abortion, unwanted pregnancies, and any number of the responsibilities associated with those types of things. And it's you will literally find legislation that's been put forward to regulate to both reduce regulations on both parties, male and female, for those types of things, because it tends to be male and female. And you'll also see in different areas regulations to acts that have been proposed that would increase the punishments associated with those things. So we have two competing interests with different parties in different directions at the same time. And that's the way just that one element runs, just related to reproduction. And so figuring out what is the actual moral stance to have, what is the best way forward. And for the most people, that's a rough one. Boy, is that a rough one.
The thing that I think is interesting, you said that key thing, you said for the most people.
yeah,
Like the majority. See, the problem is with all these laws they're passing,
Yes.
they're just greasing the squeaky wheel. The people
Yes.
that are-
And that's how it works. And then whenever
That's
it
how
doesn't
it
work,
works, exactly.
and when it stops working like that, what you get is you get societal
Whoever,
breakdown.
whoever complains the loudest is the
Yeah.
ones that they help.
Yeah,
They
and
can't make these laws for.
And it's sort of like, what is it? Probably really early in the semester when we were talking about like things like utilitarianism. One of the basis of that is that numbers game is ideally what should be running it. At the same time, we have the issues that we have with whether you want to talk about it from diversity or in just balancing it. It's like, okay, just our governmental structure, realize it's as complex as it is because it tries to balance those interests. You get into the theoretical and those numbers side, that squeaky wheel is the biggest thing. And then whatever is the apparent popular, I don't want to say issue, but direction, maybe movement, is the way people move, and that's kind of why the party was split, why they have and all that stuff. Because they're speaking to their audiences rather than commonality. But you get to kind of see, it's like, how far does this extend? You know, what kinds of things will people look to regulate? How much will someone look to regulate someone else? And that kind of gets to the heart of it right there, is what will allow people to regulate for others. And ultimately what it comes down to is, okay, probably the biggest problem is at the beginning, the outset, is who are we really dealing with? Are we dealing with government for actual public good? Because those two things are intertwined and hard to separate out. From there, are there actual harms that are produced? To what degree are they produced to whom? And if we're dealing with groups on aggregate, that's completely different than individuals and direct. And then if you start dealing with social harm, it's like, are we talking about the real tangible ones, or are we talking about some of those ancillary ones? You know, it's like social harms. You know, here that it mentions, like, just as a pulling one out, Harry Potter. The witchcraft and the way that's sometimes viewed, or dancing, like in religion. Some religions, like, you don't dance at all. It's like, okay, does that, if we were to criminalize that, or yeah, we'll say criminalize, it's like, does that produce any harm? It's like, well, to some degree, it will produce some social harms. You'll have some aspects of life that are limited, some truncation. Balancing it out, that's what you want to do. Let's see, here's where it starts moving in sex stuff, which I think I've really pretty much covered. Sex-related offenses. There was another point I wanted to talk about, but we'll see about it. Yeah, that's horrible situations there. Sexual exploitation. Paraphilias are where you've got different things that people enjoy, which are things that are very bizarre. It lists a few here that relate to that. Yeah, and they are bizarre, whether it's yeah,
with what?
yeah, so it's like frauderism. You like touching people who are not consenting in public places in the United States. You got voyeurism. You like to watch people when they don't know. You know, exhibition. You like to expose yourself, right? Sadomasochism. Everyone knows that. You're in education. No, I'm just kidding.
So that's all under that heading of.
Yeah, these are different paraphilias, and these are just some that have at some point been outlawed. Like, yeah, you don't touch people who don't want it, no matter where you're at, right? You don't try to watch people whenever they have privacy. You don't expose yourself, right? Sadomasochism is one of those ones that tends to be disturbing for people if they see it, kind of thing. But that's one thing. Like I said, that's education for you. No, I'm just kidding. Back joke. Basically, what you're talking about there is that pain, introducing pain into these areas, and whether it's one's enjoyment of receiving or inflicting. It's a dark thing. Pedophilia we've already talked about, and it kind of goes into more discussion about pedophilia, but it doesn't talk about some of those.
So are they saying that's they regulate that because this could be harmful to the okay.
Yeah, these are ones that are criminalized, and basically that to some degree that there's some, I guess, reasonableness in some of those behaviors. I don't know if they're trying to say that or what. Because it's like this one right here, there's no reasonableness to this at all. But you can see how society's moving.
I think it's
Oh yeah. Yeah.
They don't realize how much they're messing these poor kids up.
No, they don't. And see here, look right here. Psychiatric disorder whenever adults or teen over the age of 16 is attracted to generally ages 11 to 13 or younger. It's like, okay, look at those ages again and think back to that thing I showed you just a minute ago about the ages involved. It's like, what are those limits that you say, okay, your victims are generally this, really? Because anyone that's under the age of 18 falls into that area, right? As the way it is written, as it is in stanchion. All right, here it talks about male versus females. You can find females too. It's just they don't get the same amount of attention at all. They don't offend in the same numbers, at least that we know of. That kind of thing.
I'd say that's probably what it is.
Yeah, there's part of that, and there's also the disparate treatment. It's has to do with that social acceptability, the social harm. It's like the value of engaging in sexual behaviors for men versus women, and how society looks at those things different. And so you can see that reflected there. Prostitution we talked about already. Yeah. Here it talks about some of the other sides of it. It's like sometimes it's not about and see what's that. You just want somebody to listen to them. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's about that time or attention. Maybe it's about those acts. Being able to separate those things out is a very difficult thing. If you look at the history of it, yeah, it goes back to the ancient times, beyond ancient times, really. And if you start looking at it, you'll see that they've served different roles. They've had different stances on it. Society has in different times. But you'll see that you know, basically the nature of it's going to be dictated by how society well wants to view it. You know, here at this point in time, 0 as 20th century began, think of all the race relations stuff. And here, fear white slavery, girls being moved into prostitution, right? It's seen as that because that point in time, that was the biggest threat kind of thing as what people would see. Here, you'll see it as, yeah, defined as non-marital activity. There's an economic transaction and emotional indifference. That's how they typify it for this one.
So is there different, there must be different degrees of, because okay.
Basically, what they did here is they just try to say, here are your basic elements to define it as a form of prostitution. And so it's like, okay, and just a small change there changes it to something different, right? And so, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, go ahead, but I was just saying, when you get into actually kidnapping people and putting them into, you know, that's
completely different.
Than a woman who just decides to go out on her own and do.
Yeah.
Mind, it's
Anyone who engages in like what it's not the word's not consent. There's a C word for it. Not consort. No, not concubine. Escort. It was actually an E word. There's a C in it though. It's like escort services. It's like you're in theory hired as an escort, as in to accompany someone, but what does it really translate into? Does it translate into those sexual acts? And at that point in time, you're right back over here. Here, it'll mention some of those numbers has been decreasing over time. And then here's some of the parts where it'll talk about different directions things are going. Yeah, so we'll talk about, okay, here's the nature of how sex markets work in inner cities, you know, get pimps and that kind of thing. Here's how it works in different places. Here's how it works in Nevada where they can have it legalized. Here's, you know, the role of internet on it. You know, as an underground economy is low risk. Again, go back to the statements about OnlyFans. Is that not the same kind of thing? It's like, is it? Yeah, basically kind of. You start moving in that same kind of area. Here's where it starts talking about some of those other implications for things that we've criminalized. It's like, okay, now we're going to criminalize the different types of relationships or the specific acts related into sex. And it's like, yeah, those are all things that at different points in time in society we've regulated. We don't necessarily need to do so to be functional though. But we'll pick up with that next time. We do not have class on Wednesday. I have a conflict that will keep me away from here on that day. So we won't meet on Wednesday. We'll pick up on Monday. We'll finish this out and move into drug types and then move on from there. Because when you start getting into the drug abuse, that's the next big area where you start to see legalization of multiple types and then the ancillary results. And so it's one of those things. Are there harms produced? Is it a victimless crime? How do you want to look at it? What's your point of view kind of thing? And it's all relative. It really is. And so with that, I will let you guys go for today. If you have any questions, let me know. And with that, have a great day. Cool. Excellent.
Oh, my
Bye.
You're gonna be able to get